I know I've been saying this a lot here lately, but Donald Trump just got some really bad news once again, this time pertaining to the first federal indictment for the willful retention of classified and national defense information. Long story short, one of the key players in that case has made a formal, official, cooperative agreement with special counsel Jack Smith to flip on Donald Trump. And that's really bad news for him and great news for the rest of us. But before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell. Maybe check out my Patreon. I'd appreciate the support. All right, folks, so this is relatively speaking breaking news. So I'm sure additional details will be forthcoming, and I'll let Wolf Blitzer do like the heavy lifting with all the fancy graphics, and then we're going to unpack it together. But just as a quick refresher, this concerns the first federal indictment, okay? Not the January 6th indictment, not the Georgia indictment, not the potential campaign finance violations out of New York. This is about and this is a bit of a misnomer, the classified documents case. That's a misnomer because at this point, it doesn't matter whether or not the documents were classified or declassified. The fact of the matter is Donald Trump was not legally allowed to have those documents, especially when the National Archives and Justice Department asked for them back. And he certainly wasn't authorized to share critical national defense information with unauthorized personnel, as we know that he did on tape. Okay, so this is pertaining to that case. We're going to let Wolf Blitzer take it away, and then we will unpack it together.
Details coming out of this very historic first televised hearing in the Georgia election case, but we also have breaking news in the federal classified documents case down in Florida. One of the key players has just flipped against former President Trump and is now cooperating with the special counsel Jack Smith's office. That, according to the former defense attorney for Mar-a-Lago IT worker Yusel Taveras, who says Taveras has agreed to testify in the case, and in exchange, he will not, repeat, not be prosecuted. Both Taveras and Carlos de la Vieira, the club's property manager, were initially suspected of giving false testimony after denying allegations that they tried to erase incriminating security camera footage.
Yeah, so there you go. That's a pretty big deal. Now, Yusel Taveras was first mentioned in the superseding indictment on that first federal indictment. You had the initial indictment, which was, I can't remember what the term is, but it's like a narrative indictment where they break it down like chronologically, almost as if it were a story for laymen. And then there was a superseding indictment with additional context and additional charges added. And in the superseding indictment, that's when we first learned about the man that we now know to be Yusel Taveras, who was the director of IT at Mar-a-Lago, Trump's residence. And basically, long story short, Walt Nauta, who was one of Trump's employees and allegedly a co-conspirator in the situation, that on Trump's behalf, Nauta reached out to Yusel Taveras, the director of IT at Mar-a-Lago, and basically tried to get him to help determine, locate, and purge surveillance information, security footage pertaining to those documents. Because again, the National Archives and the Justice Department were on the lookout and trying to they knew that there were documents that Trump should not have and that the National Archives needed back, and they were, going back and forth with Trump for more than a year to try to get these documents back. Trump, for whatever reason, wanted to keep the documents, and so he wanted to conceal evidence, security footage, surveillance footage, that they were ever at Mar-a-Lago in the first place, and that was what Yusel Taveras' involvement was. He's mentioned, I think, like 23 times as Trump employee number 4 in the superseding indictment, and I would encourage you to go back and read it because we're not going to go through the indictment itself. Now, again, this is really bad news because this is a key witness, a key player in the case against Trump. I will remind you, while that almost certainly, is bad news for him legally, like this is obviously not good news. Just a couple of things to kind of keep perspective about. Number one, this case, this first federal indictment, will be adjudicated by a Trump-appointed judge in Florida, Judge Aileen Cannon. And in the past, she has bent over backwards and just basically shattered jurisprudence to the point where she was reprimanded by her conservative legal superiors and many of her decisions overruled late last year because she bent over backwards to accommodate Trump, almost like somebody would a patron. So we have no reason to believe that she will behave responsibly in this case, okay, right? Also, even if Trump were convicted of any or all of the charges, because I think it's like 40-something charges or perhaps 40 charges in this case, 40 individual counts of like 2 or 3 different crimes, none of them would preclude him from A, running for office, and B, being elected president. So he could be convicted. of all these things, of every crime in the first federal case, and still technically run for president and still technically win the presidency. It would be unprecedented circumstances, right? He'd probably be, again, I say run the country. Donald Trump never really did that in the first place because he was lazy and disengaged. But he would be the nation's chief executive from a jail cell or something, or he would be the nation's chief executive in the White House with an ankle bracelet and some sort of parole officer. I have no idea. So this does not, even if Trump is found guilty, and again, this is one additional piece of evidence or a development that is clearly working against him. He still has a very sympathetic judge, and even if he's found guilty of all these things, it would not necessarily keep him from the presidency in terms of disqualifying him, because none of the charges in question do disqualify him. That comes from the 14th Amendment. But anyway, really bad news for Donald Trump. I'm sure he's not happy about this, which means it's great news for the rest of us, and we will continue to follow this particular story as it unfolds.